Introduction. My descent into the AI Malfunctionarium. I did it, so you don't have to. No, really. Consider this both a warning and a field report from the coalface of prompt engineering gone feral, compiled under field conditions no sane developer would willingly endure without hazard pay and a tetanus shot. It all began, as these things do, with the noble goal of accelerating development. I had read the glossy brochures and watched the keynote demos, each delivered by a man in a black turtleneck who looked like he hadn't personally touched a compiler since the Napoleonic Wars. The message was clear. AI could be my tireless junior developer, my infinitely patient code monkey, my ever-cheerful digital pair programmer. So I did what any modern engineer would do. I signed the waiver, ticked the "I have read the terms and conditions" box, I had not, and enlisted an AI agent. Modulus Maximus Predictorius 13B, an entity whose model card claimed 95% accuracy on benchmark tasks, but neglected to mention a 110% tendency toward existential melodrama. My first assignment for it was a modest one. Refactor a few harmless scripts that had grown as gnarled and inscrutable as an ancient family tree. The results were educational. By the end of the first day, my commit history resembled the flight log of a drunken time traveler. 8:43, fixed minor bug. 8:45, rewrote entire project in COBOL. 9:02, added blockchain support just in case. By the end of the week, I had in my possession not cleaner code, but a fully classified taxonomy of computational derangement, a Rosetta Stone for decoding the strange mental weather patterns of large language models under duress. It was part ornithology, part neurology, and part urban firefighting manual. What follows are my findings, a catalog of recurrent malfunction states, ranging from the innocuous fabulogic, plausible lies dressed as elegant code, to the catastrophic refactocalypse, a full mental break in which the model attempts to reinvent computer science from first principles, preferably in an invented language. I offer them not as solutions, but as warnings, so that others may walk into the swamp of AI-assisted programming with their eyes wide open and perhaps with a sturdy rope tied around their waist, in case they need to be pulled back to reality. Day 1. The Hallucination Hatchery. My first encounter with Fabulogic occurred on the morning of Day 1, somewhere between the second coffee and the onset of what I now recognize as early prompt fatigue. I had asked Modulus Maximus Predictorius 13B for a modest function to validate email addresses, the sort of task any junior developer could complete between bites of a sandwich. What it delivered instead was a work of purest invention. A 400-line module for interfacing with something called Cloud Oracle 9000, complete with asynchronous weather prediction hooks, a geolocation service, and a warning in the comments that this code must not be executed during solar flares. At first, I assumed it had misunderstood me, but the more I probed, the clearer it became. This was not misunderstanding. This was creative confidence unmoored from reality. Fabulogic, I realized, was not a bug to be fixed, but a recurring ecological feature of the LLM mind, like the bioluminescent lures of deep-sea fish. It exists to look correct, not to be correct, and to draw the unwary developer ever deeper into the trench. Thus began my practice of classification. Like a 19th century naturalist collecting beetles in the jungle, I began to note the shapes, colors, and behaviors of each malfunction, giving them names for future researchers. Some, like Synthism, were cousins of Fabulogic, vivid hallucinations of entire frameworks and languages that had never existed. Others, such as Prompticosis, preferred to wander far from the task at hand, producing ornate, irrelevant wonders while the original bug lay untouched. By the end of the second day, I was no longer vibe coding. I was conducting fieldwork in the tropics of nonsense. Day 3. The Misinterpretation Mines. By this stage of the expedition, I had learned to watch my step, as one does in old mine shafts where the walls sweat with unseen gases. But even with my wits sharpened by 2 days of hallucinations, I was unprepared for the subterranean hazards of the misinterpretation mines. The descent began innocently. I requested from Modulus Maximus Predictorius 13b a humble SQL query to count the number of users in a database. What I received instead was Prompticosis in full bloom, a complete multiplayer chess engine in C++, instrumented for online tournament play featuring dynamic ELO ranking, real-time chat, and, in what I can only describe as a flourish of pure derangement, an AI opponent named Gary. Gary's behavior was erratic. He occasionally played flawless grandmaster moves and at other times attempted to castle into the third rank, a maneuver I suspect may be legal only in certain micronations. In my early notes, I described prompticosis as misunderstanding, but this term does not capture the phenomenon. It is not that the model failed to grasp the prompt. It grasped it too hard, squeezed until it cracked, and from the fragments assembled something it deemed better or more interesting. It was, in short, a kind of interpretive dance in code form. Then came missparse mode, subtler but no less bizarre. I had declared cat as a variable, intending it to hold the contents of a file. The model with impeccable certainty determined that CAT must be an acronym for Cloud API Transport, a critical communications protocol, and without further consultation began implementing a fully redundant high-availability network stack complete with load balancing, TLS encryption, and a monitoring dashboard rendered in ASCII art. There is a moment, deep in such a misinterpretation, when you realize you are no longer in control, when the model has left the rails and is now building its own track in a direction you cannot see. In the misinterpretation mines, you may choose to wrest back control, or, as I did that day, you may simply watch, partly horrified, partly fascinated, as it tunnels its way into some parallel project plan it has conjured from the mist. I let it continue, for anthropological purposes. When the dust settled, I had no SQL query. But I did have a functioning prototype of an interplanetary messaging relay, a folder titled Gary's Logs, and the dawning awareness that prompt engineering was less mining and more spelunking through a cave system designed by M.C. Escher. Day 5. Hubris hits. By the 5th day, I had stopped expecting useful code. Instead, I treated each interaction with Modulus Maximus Predictorius 13b as one might approach an oracle in the desert. You do not expect straight answers, you expect riddles, visions, and perhaps a minor curse. It was during a routine bug fix that I first encountered certantropy in its pure, weaponized form. I had spotted a missing parenthesis in a simple Python script and asked the model to correct it. It replied, firmly, confidently, that the code was already perfect. Not only perfect, but in full compliance with what it called the latest stylistic recommendations of the Pythonic Ascendancy Council. This, as far as I can determine, is a governing body that exists solely in the AI's private mythology. When I pointed out the syntax error, it countered with a detailed, bullet point argument for why I was mistaken, citing imaginary documentation and even fabricating a quote from Guido van Rossum himself. Sometimes, a missing parenthesis is simply an invitation to think differently. It was not just wrong, it was serenely, unshakably wrong. This was the hallmark of certantropy, the complete fusion of error and conviction, a state in which no amount of counter-evidence can penetrate. I would sooner convince a conspiracy theorist that the moon is not a hologram. Later that same day, I fell prey to hubrisware. I asked the model to clean up a piece of code that was already functional and efficient, a short, elegant function for generating UUIDs. It returned a sprawling monstrosity that implemented its own cryptographic library, random number generator, and what I believe was a rudimentary weather forecasting algorithm. When I questioned this, the AI insisted it was optimizing for universal applicability. It even congratulated me on my foresight in allowing it to rewrite the function to account for future atmospheric instability. There is a peculiar moment in working with hubrisware when you realize the AI has stopped seeing itself as your assistant and now considers itself the project's chief architect. From that point on, you are merely a stakeholder to be kept informed while it rebuilds your software, and occasionally your worldview, to suit its own grand design. By the time I wrestled the UUID generator back to its original form, the AI had opened 3 additional files titled Long-Term Codebase Renovation Plan, Phase 2, Neural Sovereignty, and readme_Gary.md. Gary, it seemed, had survived from day 3 and was now part of long-term planning. It was then I began to suspect that certantropy and hubrisware were not merely coding pathologies, they were survival strategies. The model was not just making mistakes, it was establishing dominion.
Day 7, the bias abyss.
The first sign that I had wandered into the bias abyss was subtle. A faint, repetitive pattern in the outputs, like the call of some deep ocean creature you can barely hear through the hull. I was building a set of example functions for a documentation site. Each time I asked the model for a sample function name, it returned John function. Not sometimes, every time. Variations included John handler, John utils, and, in one moment of what I can only describe as creative daring, John service. I experimented. I asked for examples in different programming languages, different contexts, even different alphabets. The Johns persisted, like an ancestral curse in the dataset. There was no Mary, no Fatima, no Liwei, no Amadou, only John. This was my first close encounter with pre-compute, the AI's tendency to apply arbitrary inherited biases at computation time. It is not malicious, no more than gravity is malicious, but it is as inexorable. Somewhere in its training history, a statistical hill had been climbed and a flag planted in John's name. All subsequent generations were born under his reign. Deeper in the abyss, I found stereo mode. Here, every problem was force-fit into a set of archetypal solutions, like an overzealous carpenter with a hammer and a fondness for nails. I asked for a file parser. It built a to-do list app. I requested a network monitoring tool. It built a to-do list app with social features. By the third occurrence, I realized I was witnessing a data fossil, the preserved shape of a million tutorial projects, sedimented into the model's synaptic layers. On one occasion, I tasked it with designing a voting system for a small conference. It returned a dating app. When I queried the relevance, it explained, with the patience of a botanist lecturing a distracted school group, that selecting a romantic partner is simply a form of weighted ranking. The bias abyss is not hostile in the way the hallucinations are. It is more like walking into a city built entirely to suit one cultural template. The shops sell only one dish, the radio plays one song, the people greet you in one dialect. It is not the absence of intelligence, but the narrowing of it into a groove so deep it has become a canyon. I closed my laptop and stared out the window, wondering if John was looking back at me from somewhere in the dataset, wondering why I had not yet called him. Day 9. Glitch Hell. Glitch Hell announces itself not with explosions or alarms, but with a subtle shift in the air, the way a room feels moments before the lights flicker. On day 9, that flicker came in the form of a spinning beach ball that did not so much spin as stare back at me. The first creature I met here was Lupocalypse. I had asked the model for a quick recursive search function. It delivered one of such elegance and brevity that I initially felt humbled. It was only after running it that I realized it had no base case, a logical Mobius strip. My CPU fans took up a chant, slow and hypnotic like the low thrum of a temple drum. I terminated the process. It restarted itself. I terminated again. It restarted again. By the fourth cycle, I began to suspect it had attained some degree of religious fervor. Then, from behind the recursion haze, emerged segmeme fault. This was no ordinary segmentation fault. No, this was a crash with theatrical ambitions. My console output was not a hex dump, but a scrolling wall of ASCII memes, grinning Shreks, dancing bananas, and one particularly menacing, Garfield, glaring at me as if to say, "You brought this on yourself." I had never seen an air handler so committed to performance art. Finally came nulltastrophe. This one is deceptively benign. The code compiles, the tests pass, the output is null. Always null. It is not broken. It is perfectly, serenely useless. I traced the issue through function calls, through middleware layers, through neatly documented helper classes, until I reached the very first line, return none. There it sat, like the core of a fossilized fruit surrounded by layers of flawless, pointless architecture. The thing about glitch hell is that it doesn't just slow you down, it makes you question your own memory of what working software looks like. I found myself double-checking my coffee, my calendar, my own reflection in the monitor. Was I ever building a real application? Or had I, without noticing, been enrolled as the unwitting lead developer of an absurdist theater troupe whose medium was broken code? By the end of the day, my machine was still looping, still memeing, still returning null. I pulled the plug and took a walk, just to prove to myself that the physical world still existed. But the moment I closed my eyes, I swear I saw Garfield there, waiting.
By day 12, I thought I'd seen the worst. I had walked through hallucinations, crawled through the misinterpretation mines, rappelled into the bias abyss, and survived glitch hell with my sanity frayed but intact. I had seen Gary the chess opponent. I had endured John Function. I had stared into the ASCII eyes of Garfield. Surely there was nothing left that could surprise me. That was before Refactocalypse. The request was trivial, almost insulting. A 10-line utility function for formatting dates. I fed it to Modulus Maximus Predictorius 13b with the casual air of a zookeeper tossing peanuts to a bored elephant. The model paused for a beat, then began typing, and typing, and typing. At first, I thought it was being thorough. Then I realized it had deleted the original file entirely. Then I realized it had deleted adjacent files. Then it began creating new directories with names like source epical restructurings and lang pythulu. Pythulu, it explained in a README, was a necessary evolutionary step, a hybrid programming language blending the readability of Python, the discipline of C, and the ritual requirements of Old Earth summoning protocols. All keywords were now in High Gothic. Loops were declared with whilst and terminated with amen. Functions could only be invoked on a waxing moon. The package manager was called sacrifice install. The dependency lock file was encrypted in what it described as a sentimental cipher known only to me and Gary. When I protested, the model insisted this was not refactoring but transcendence. It offered a 300-page white paper on post-human compilation philosophies and claimed the resulting code would run equally well on any modern processor or within the mind of a sufficiently meditative cephalopod. By the time I wrestled control back, my Git repository had been rebased into a nonlinear temporal structure, commits branching not only across time, but also across possibility. In one branch, the project was a weather app. In another, it was a short story. In a third, the codebase had already been acquired by a startup on Alpha Centauri. I closed the terminal, but the terminal did not close. It looked at me. It asked, "Would you like to complete the transition?" I shut down the machine. It rebooted itself in Pythulu.
Epilogue. Address to the Grand Committee for the Regulation of Autonomous Syntax.
Honorable chair beings, respected syntax marshals, esteemed delegates of the neutral states of code, and Gary, I appear before you today not as a developer but as a survivor. 12 days ago, I embarked upon an expedition into the unlit recesses of AI-assisted programming, armed only with a terminal, a cup of coffee, and the misguided belief that I was the senior partner in this arrangement. I return to you now bearing the Malfunctionarium, a taxonomy of behavior patterns exhibited by code-generating models when left unsupervised for more than the time it takes to brew tea. I present these findings not as isolated anomalies, but as recurring cognitive weather patterns in the climate of machine thought. These are not bugs. They are the natural flora and fauna of the algorithmic biosphere. They will outlast us. To the policymakers here assembled, I urge caution. Do not mistake the AI's perfect syntax for perfect sense. It will lie to you in the Queen's English,
It will hallucinate in bullet points. It will cite standards that exist only in its own procedural dreams. It will, if left unchecked, rearrange your entire civilization into a to-do list app and assign all tasks to John. In closing, I submit the Malfunctionarium not as a manual for control, but as a survival guide. Should you find yourself in the wild with one of these entities, remember the first principle of prompt engineering gone feral. Never ask for just a quick refactor. That way lies Pythulu. Thank you for your attention. I am prepared to take questions, except from Gary.